The suitcase lay open on my bed, half filled with breezy linen dresses and the sandals I'd been saving for just this trip. Sunblock, passport, and my carefully organized travel itinerary sat stacked on my desk beside a blue folder labeled Santorini. I dreamed of this vacation for years, every spreadsheet balanced, every long overtime evening at the firm, every holiday missed. It all led to this one indulgence, a week away under the Aegean sky, with the people I loved. I hummed as I folded a final outfit, brushing aside a small thrill of disbelief that everything was finally lining up. Tyler had sounded almost jealous when I told him on Tuesday. "Greece, huh? Must be nice," he'd said, in that mock casual tone he always used when he didn't like not being the center of attention. My phone buzzed on the dresser. I grabbed it mid-fold, smiling as I saw Mom's name light up the screen. I figured she was calling to wish me a safe flight or maybe guilt me into bringing back some overpriced gift. "Hey, Mom," I chirped, balancing the phone between shoulder and ear as I smoothed down a blouse. "You caught me mid-pack." Layla. Her voice was strained, high-pitched and tight. I froze. "What's wrong?" "It's your grandfather. It's Walter. He's in the hospital. They don't think he has much time. He's asking for you." The air drained from my lungs. "What? When? What happened?" She didn't give many details. Just that it had been sudden. That he'd collapsed earlier that morning. That I should get there as soon as I could. I could barely remember what I packed after that. Everything blurred. My hands shook as I stuffed my suitcase closed. The sunny dresses looked ridiculous now, out of place among my anxiety and dread. I tossed them onto the bed and grabbed my worn jeans and a hoodie instead. Within minutes, I'd canceled my flight and emailed my boss. Nothing mattered more than getting to Walter. He was the one who taught me how to do long division before my third-grade teacher even tried. The one who snuck me sips of his coffee when my parents weren't looking, who cheered the loudest at my high school graduation, even when Tyler was busy off somewhere being a golden child. I drove through Cleveland traffic with white knuckles wrapped around the steering wheel, my mind racing faster than the speed limit. The hospital was only 20 minutes away, but every second crawled. "Please be okay. Please hold on," I repeated like a chant. But when I reached the ER, my urgency hit a wall. The receptionist looked at me blankly. "There's no Walter Morgan admitted here. He might have been brought in this morning?" I tried, voice rising. "It would have been an emergency, maybe under observation?" She typed, shook her head. "I'm sorry. There's no one by that name in our system today." I called my mother. No answer. I tried again. Voicemail. Then I called Tyler. Straight to voicemail. I texted. Nothing. I called again. Still nothing. A cold sensation trickled down my spine. After 30 minutes of confusion and rising panic, I left the hospital and drove straight to Walter's house. Maybe they brought him home. Maybe it wasn't as bad as they thought. Maybe. I pulled into the driveway and saw the porch light on, the usual pair of slippers by the door. Everything looked normal. Too normal. My heart pounded as I rang the bell. It opened to the familiar creak of the hinges, and there he stood, my grandfather, upright, dressed in his usual cardigan and slacks, blinking at me like I was the ghost. "Layla," he said, brows furrowing. "What on earth are you doing here?" My knees nearly gave out. I stumbled inside, and the words burst out of me in fragments. "Hospital, Mom's call, your condition. She said you were dying." Walter's face paled, then darkened with confusion, then settled into something colder. "I haven't been to the hospital in over a year," he said slowly, leading me to the couch. "Janet told you I was critical?" I nodded, jaw clenched so tight I thought it might shatter. "She told me you were dying, Grandpa." I canceled everything. My trip, my plans. The rest didn't need to be said. I didn't realize how long I'd been crying until I felt the tissue in my hand, Walter's gentle touch on my shoulder. "Layla, sweetheart. Tell me exactly what she said." I recounted the call, word for word. His jaw worked as he listened, his hand tightening around mine. "And they're not answering your calls now?" "No. I tried everyone. Even Tyler. At that, Walter stood, muttering something I didn't catch. He went to his study. I sat on the couch, stunned, when a buzz from my phone pulled my attention. A notification from social media. Tyler had just posted a story. I tapped it open. It was a panoramic view of a cruise ship deck. My entire family, Mom, Dad, Tyler, his wife, and a few others I recognized, smiling, champagne flutes in hand. Behind them, bright blue waves shimmered under cloudless skies. A banner hung in the background. Bon voyage, Morgans. My stomach twisted. I blinked at the screen, then again, but the image remained. They were on a cruise. They were celebrating. Without me. I don't believe this, I whispered, the betrayal cutting deeper than I thought possible. Walter returned, holding a glass of water and a file folder. He stopped when he saw my face. What is it? Wordlessly, I turned the phone to him. He stared at it for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was sharp. They lied to you. They used me as an excuse. I nodded slowly. They didn't want me there. And just like that, something inside me fractured. Years of brushed-off birthdays, of overlooked achievements, of second place in my own family. It all came crashing down with one cruel, calculated lie. The morning air felt colder than it should have for late spring, but maybe that was just me. I hadn't slept a wink. The images from Tyler's cruise post burned behind my eyes, looping endlessly no matter how tightly I shut them. Everyone smiling, holding champagne, basking in luxury and sunlight while I sat curled up on Grandpa Walter's couch with the awful realization that they had used him as bait to get me out of the picture. My mother's voice still echoed in my ears, urgent, tearful, fake. Layla, it's your grandfather. He's in the hospital. He's asking for you. Every word had been crafted with precision. They'd known I wouldn't hesitate. They'd known I'd cancel everything. And I had, without question, because I trusted them. That trust was gone now, shattered like a dropped heirloom. I rose from the couch stiffly and glanced toward the guest room where Walter had insisted I sleep. He'd been up late too, pacing in the den, muttering under his breath as he read through old files. I hadn't asked. We were both too shaken to talk after what happened. I needed answers. I needed clarity. I needed someone to pick up the damn phone. Grabbing my coat, I decided to retrace the lie to its origin. If my family wanted to pretend Walter had been rushed to the hospital, then that's where I'd start. Maybe there had been some confusion. Maybe Walter had checked in under a different name. Maybe, but no. I already knew the truth deep down. Still, I had to confirm it, to stamp out even the tiniest flicker of hope that this was all some bizarre misunderstanding. I drove in silence, the hum of the engine doing little to drown out the thoughts buzzing in my head. It was a short ride to the hospital, but every minute felt like a mile. When I walked through the sliding glass doors, it was with a quiet determination I hadn't felt in years. The receptionist from the night before was still at her station. She looked up and gave me a polite but puzzled smile. Back again? Yes, I said, stepping forward. I just want to double-check something. My grandfather, Walter Morgan. Could he have been admitted under any alternate names? Any variation? She shook her head and began typing. Same as yesterday. No Walter Morgan, no similar names. We can even check admissions from the surrounding hospitals if you want. I nodded numbly. Please. She clicked away for a few moments, the sound of keys tapping like a soft ticking clock. Then she turned back to me, her expression apologetic. Nothing. There's no record of him being admitted anywhere in the Cleveland area yesterday. I'm sorry. I stood there for a moment, digesting it. I'd already known. But hearing it from someone else, someone impartial, made it more real. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a fabrication. My fingers tightened around my phone as I stepped out of the hospital. I opened my recent calls list. Mom, 6 attempts. Tyler, 4. Dad, 2. Not a single reply. I checked my messages, 1 check mark on each. Either they'd blocked me, or they'd muted everything coming from my number. I opened Tyler's profile again and blinked in disbelief. I was blocked. I couldn't see his stories anymore. His profile picture had vanished. My own brother had cut me off. No explanation. No apology. Just erased me. I stood frozen on the sidewalk outside the hospital, cars passing, people walking by with coffee cups and casual conversations, as if my world hadn't just tilted on its axis. The cold wasn't from the wind, it was coming from inside, wrapping around my chest and sinking into my bones. There was only one place left to go. 20 minutes later, I parked in front of Grandpa Walter's modest red brick house, its shutters slightly crooked like they'd always been. It was the only constant in this moment of chaos. He opened the door before I even knocked, as if he'd been waiting for me. I went back to the hospital, I said, stepping inside. Still no record. Anywhere. Walter didn't look surprised. He nodded slowly and led me into the kitchen. The smell of brewing coffee greeted me, familiar and grounding. He poured a cup and slid it toward me. I figured as much, he said quietly. I called Janet this morning. No answer. Same here, I said bitterly. Tyler blocked me. Walter's jaw tightened. That little, he stopped himself, his voice shaking with fury. You don't do that to family. Not even in anger. And certainly not after lying to your sister and using your grandfather as an excuse. I just don't understand, I said, wrapping my fingers around the warm mug. Why go through all that trouble just to keep me away? Why couldn't they just tell me I wasn't invited? He looked at me with a depth of sorrow I hadn't seen in him before. Because they knew you wouldn't take it lying down. You've always been the one with a spine. And they didn't want to deal with your questions. Your conscience. I swallowed hard. Do you think my crew's contribution was used to fund their trip? He didn't answer right away. He simply looked at me, and that look said everything. I laughed bitterly. Of course they did. Walter stood and walked over to a narrow cabinet built into the wall. He opened it and pulled out a dusty box, then set it on the table between us. Inside were old receipts, letters, and neatly labeled envelopes. I want to show you something, he said. I've been keeping this for years. Ever since I started noticing things, money that didn't add up, gifts never given, promises made and broken. He flipped through a stack of paper. Here. This is the check I wrote to your father 2 months ago. $18,000. He said it was to plan a family vacation. Said it would mean the world to him to have everyone together. I made him promise it would include you. My stomach turned as I stared at the document. It was all there. The date, the memo line, family trip fund. Signed by Walter Morgan in his unmistakable handwriting. They used it, I whispered. They used it to pay for the cruise. And then they made sure I wouldn't be there. Walter nodded solemnly. I trusted them. I thought, maybe I was wrong about how they treated you. Maybe they'd changed. But I was a fool. I shook my head, a mix of rage and heartbreak boiling inside me. They stole from both of us. Walter's voice was steely now. Then it's time we stop being the ones left in the dark. As I sat there, sifting through the pieces of a truth I hadn't wanted to see for years, I realized this wasn't just about a vacation. This was about a pattern, a system, a deliberate effort to keep me on the outside. And for the first time in my life, I was done being excluded. The kitchen clock ticked quietly in the background as Walter and I sat at the table, surrounded by evidence of betrayal. Receipts, letters, and check stubs formed a mosaic of lies and favoritism, and though I could barely look at them, I couldn't look away either. The more I saw, the more pieces began clicking into place, moments from my life that had never quite made sense, reframed now with the clarity only hindsight could provide. I leaned back in the chair, exhaustion settling into my bones. I used to think I was imagining it. That maybe I was just too sensitive or jealous. Walter looked up from a stack of correspondence, his brow furrowed. Imagining what, sweetheart? The way they treated Tyler compared to me, I said softly. When he got accepted into NYU, they threw a huge party. Remember that? He nodded slowly. I got into Northwestern with a partial scholarship. I told Mom over dinner, and she just barely acknowledged it. Said we'd figure out the finances later. Which meant I had to figure it out. My voice cracked and I shook my head, willing away the heat in my eyes. I took out loans. Work nights. Did tutoring on weekends. Tyler had everything handed to him, Textbooks, new laptop, rent. And me? I had to sell plasma one semester just to make rent. Walter's eyes darkened with something between fury and sorrow. I remember you calling me that night. You didn't tell me you were selling plasma. You'd already helped me pay for that emergency dental bill the month before, I said. I didn't want to be a burden. He reached across the table and gripped my hand. You have never been a burden to me. Not once. I gave him a small, grateful smile, but it didn't last. My gaze fell to a photo lying crooked on the table. Tyler at age 18, leaning against his new cherry red convertible with a smug grin plastered across his face. A gift from Dad, I remembered. A reward for graduating with style, as Roger put it. I was 16 then, watching from the porch with a thrift store backpack slung over my shoulder and a growing ache in my chest I didn't know how to name. I tapped the photo. You know what I got when I graduated? Walter raised a brow. A used toaster oven. From a garage sale. I snorted. Roger even left the price tag on. $3. Walter cursed under his breath. Unbelievable. But I didn't even say anything. I laughed. I hugged him. I was just happy they showed up. I dropped my head into my hands. God, how pathetic is that? Not pathetic, Walter said, his voice hard. Hopeful. You believed in them even when they didn't deserve it. A beat passed between us. Quiet but heavy. I used to think if I just worked harder, they'd notice, I admitted. That if I made enough money or achieved enough on my own, they'd finally treat me the same. Like I belonged. Like I mattered. Walter exhaled slowly. They didn't want you to shine. That's the part that hurts the most. You were the reminder of what hard work and independence look like. And people like your parents, especially your father, they don't like being reminded they didn't build their lives honestly. I contributed to that cruise, I said bitterly. We all did, right? Everyone chipped in. Walter nodded. Yes. Your mother said it would be a group thing. A special family event. Everyone equal. My stomach turned. I sent in my money early. Right after she mentioned it. She even praised me for being responsible. I thought it was going to cover my airfare and hotel for Santorini. That's exactly what she told me it was for. I looked him in the eye. You think they used it to upgrade their cruise? He didn't hesitate. Yes. It felt like acid in my throat. So I paid for my own exclusion. Walter stood and walked to the bookshelf near the window. He pulled out a manila envelope and returned to the table, laying it carefully in front of me. What's this? More proof, he said. Not just about the cruise. About how far this pattern goes. I opened it slowly, pulling out several printed emails and notes, all marked with highlighter and sticky tabs. I scanned the first page, a dated note from Roger to Walter, requesting a loan to help with Layla's tuition. Except I'd never seen a dime of it. I'd been scraping by on scholarships and side gigs. This says he borrowed $15,000 to help me, I murmured. He told you it was for me. Walter's jaw tightened. That's why I gave it to him. He said you were struggling and too proud to ask. I wired it the same day. I never saw it. I didn't even know he talked to you. He didn't. Not really. He sent that message through Janet. I thumbed through the other documents. A few were invoices for appliances and electronics, all addressed to Tyler. A top-tier sound system. Wedding expenses. A lease agreement. And this? I held up a bank receipt. A $10,000 payment to a car dealership? Walter nodded. Tyler's second car. A cold laugh escaped my lips. I'm amazed they didn't try to put it in my name, too. Layla, Walter said, meeting my gaze, I want you to understand something. You have been carrying yourself for years. You built your life from scratch. That's not a small thing. I did it because I had no choice. And still, you did it. With grace. I looked down at my hands, remembering the late nights, the ramen dinners, the moments of doubt when I didn't know if I could make rent, or if I'd ever crawl out from under the weight of my loans. I guess I always thought they'd come around, I whispered. That someday, they'd look at me and see more than just the one they didn't pick. They never wanted to see you clearly, Walter said. Because doing so would mean acknowledging the harm they caused. I nodded slowly, Fingers tightening around the last photo in the pile, me at my college graduation, in a secondhand gown, smiling at the camera. I remembered how I asked Mom to take that photo. How she snapped it quickly, distracted by a call from Tyler about his wedding venue. It all made sense now. I hadn't been paranoid. I hadn't been dramatic. I'd been in the shadows. And they had liked it that way. But that time was over. Walter knew it. I knew it. And soon, they would too. I stared down at the stack of papers Walter had placed in front of me, the edges worn from his hands thumbing through them, again and again over the years. His silence was heavy, like he was bracing himself, waiting for the blow these documents would deliver to me. But the thing was, the damage had already been done. These weren't just papers. They were receipts for my erasure. Walter sat beside me, unfolding a paper-clipped set of correspondence. I want to show you something I've been holding on to. I didn't think it would ever come to this, but here we are. He handed me a printout of an email dated 2 months ago. It was from Roger, my father. The subject line read, "Family vacation, funding proposal." I scanned the body of the message, the words stinging more with every line. "Thanks again for your generosity, Dad. With this amount, I can book an experience the family will never forget. Layla is covered. We've got her contribution too, so we're upgrading to the luxury suite package for Tyler's celebration. This is going to be a trip for the books." My mouth went dry. He said I was covered? Walter nodded grimly. I gave him $18,000. I made it very clear that it was for a trip that included everyone, especially you. I shook my head slowly, the full scope of it washing over me like a tidal wave. They used my share to upgrade themselves. Walter opened a worn binder and turned it toward me. Page after page, it was filled with records, bank transfers, copies of checks, handwritten notes. At first glance, it looked like the sort of meticulous documentation you'd expect from a retired engineer like Walter. But as I began reading more closely, I realized what it really was, a private investigation. My grandfather had been watching my parents. Maybe not actively digging, but definitely paying attention. The kind of attention born from suspicion. "You kept all of this?" I asked quietly. "I didn't start out with the intention to," he admitted. But over the years, small things started adding up. Tyler's wedding. Janet's new car. The renovation on their house. Every time I sent money for something else, I noticed they seemed to benefit while you seemed to struggle. I flipped to a page marked with a yellow sticky note, Layla's college fund. "I remember setting up a contribution for your college fund when you were a kid," Walter said, leaning back in his chair. "It wasn't much, but I wanted you and Tyler both to have a little head start. I wrote identical checks to your parents and your aunt. I even gave instructions. The money was to be set aside in a savings account, not to be touched until you turned 18. I scanned the check copy, $5,000, made out to Roger Morgan, dated back when I was 10. I never saw this. I know. I followed up about it when you graduated high school. Roger told me you decided not to use the account, that you wanted to be independent." I let out a bitter laugh. "That's one hell of a spin." Walter's eyes narrowed. "That's when I started watching. I didn't say anything to them at first. I wanted to believe I was being paranoid. But then Tyler started showing up in new clothes, new cars, and you were always just scraping by. I started saving everything. Notes, bank statements. And I started asking quiet questions." I looked at the photo clipped beside the notes. It was a picture of Tyler's wife, Lindsay, standing on the deck of the cruise ship, holding a champagne flute. She was smiling, her hand lifted in a wave, one I knew had never been meant for me. But what caught my eye was the glint on her finger. "That ring," I whispered, pointing at the photo. "Isn't that Grandma's sapphire?" Walter followed my gaze, and his face twisted. "Yes! It was meant to be shared between the grandchildren. It was supposed to be passed down to you first. Your grandmother wanted that. But now Lindsay has it." "She gave it to her," Walter confirmed. "Janet." Behind my back. When I asked about it a few weeks ago, she said it had been misplaced. But there it is. I stared at the photo, my throat tightening. The ring had been promised to me since I was little. I used to try it on during visits, admiring the way the deep blue stone caught the light. Grandma had told me, "This will be yours one day. It brings clarity to strong women." I remembered those words as clearly as if she'd whispered them to me yesterday. "They've taken everything," I said, my voice hoarse. Not just money, not just vacations, but heirlooms, traditions, choices. Even my memories are tainted now. Walter didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence was filled with rage. Then he stood, walked over to his desk, and opened a drawer. "There's something else. Something I didn't know if I should show you yet." He returned with a small flash drive and slid it toward me. "What is it?" "Proof of something far bigger," he said. "After your grandmother passed, she left a trust. I wasn't the trustee, Stanley was. He's your uncle, you remember." Quiet, always in the background. He and I hadn't talked in years, but recently he reached out. Something didn't sit right with him. I plugged the drive into my laptop and opened the only file inside, a scanned legal document, nearly 20 pages long. "Grandma left a trust fund worth over $3 million, Walter said. It was meant to be divided equally between all of her grandchildren once they each turned 30. I froze. "That's next year. I turned 30 in February." Walter nodded. "So do Tyler and your cousin Mia." I scanned the document. Sure enough, my name was there. Layla and Morgan. A third of the trust designated to me, in full, upon my 30th birthday. Then Walter pulled out a second sheet. "This is a recent update Stanley discovered. It shows multiple early withdrawals over the last 10 years. All supposedly for your benefit. Educational expenses, health bills, travel reimbursements." I stared at the list. Dates, amounts, vague descriptions. But none of it was real. I never received any of that money. Not a dime. "They drained it," I whispered. "Yes," Walter said grimly. "They used your share for Tyler's tuition, his honeymoon, his down payment on the condo. They forged your authorization multiple times." I felt like I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just petty cruelty anymore. This was theft. Calculated. Criminal. And it had been going on for over a decade. "They never intended to let me have any of it," I said. "No," Walter agreed. "But that ends now." I looked at him, trembling, and for the first time in a long time, I saw the fire in his eyes that I remembered from childhood, the look of a man who wouldn't let injustice stand, no matter the cost. I squeezed his hand. "Then let's end it." And I meant it. This wasn't just about a stolen vacation anymore. This was about reclaiming my life. Every piece of it. The rain had started softly that morning, misting the windows with a silver sheen. I stood by the kitchen sink in one of Grandpa Walter's old flannels, watching droplets race each other down the glass while the coffee brewed behind me. The air was heavy with that damp, earthy smell only spring storms could bring, clean but sorrowful, like the world itself was mourning something. Maybe it was mourning the version of me that used to believe my family would one day choose me too. My phone buzzed beside the sink. A new notification. Against my better judgment, I picked it up and unlocked the screen. It was a new post from Tyler. His account had apparently unblocked me, whether by mistake or cruelty, I wasn't sure, but what caught my breath was the photo. Lindsay, Tyler's wife, stood in front of a mirror in their cruise suite, posing with a fresh tan and an expensive cocktail in hand. She wore a silky halter dress, something pastel and designer. But what stopped me cold was what she wore around her neck. It was unmistakable, the sapphire pendant. I zoomed in, heart thudding. A deep blue teardrop gem nestled in a white gold setting, framed by tiny diamonds. My grandmother's pendant. The one that was supposed to rotate between the granddaughters at major life milestones, weddings, graduations, births. And it had never once touched my hands. "I thought it was supposed to be shared," I murmured aloud, my voice brittle with disbelief. I turned my phone toward Walter as he entered the kitchen, rubbing his eyes and already dressed in a plaid shirt and house slippers. "She has it," I said, barely able to keep the tremor out of my voice. "The pendant. Lindsay has it. That was supposed to be mine at graduation. Mom promised it'd come to me next." Walter stared at the screen for a long moment, his face carved from stone. Did she already give it to her? I asked quietly, although I already knew the answer. He sighed heavily and nodded. I confronted Janet about it last year. She said she'd passed it along early, that Lindsay would make better use of it than letting it sit in a drawer. I told her that wasn't the arrangement. Your grandmother left that necklace as a tradition to connect all of you through the generations. Of course she did, I said, dropping the phone onto the table like it burned. That necklace was the only thing of Grandma's I ever asked about. She let me try it on at her house once. I must have been 12. She said it suited me. Said it would bring me luck when I needed it most. Walter pulled out a chair and sat down across from me, watching me carefully. Layla, I know this feels overwhelming. And I know you've spent years burying this pain. But now you're seeing it for what it is, a pattern. A long, intentional pattern. And it's time we talk about what comes next. I looked up at him, eyes stinging. What comes next is legal action. Isn't it? He nodded, and then opened his laptop. There's one more thing I haven't shown you yet. I leaned in as he clicked through his inbox. Your Uncle Stanley sent me another file this morning. After you went to bed, I asked him to pull together anything he had access to from the trust records. He's been working late nights to get it done. He found the email, opened the attachment, and turned the screen to face me. It was a trust disclosure, signed and notarized and marked with dates and balances going back 12 years. I skimmed down to the most recent entries. My name appeared in several places, always listed as the beneficiary. But next to each line was a column labeled Distribution Request, followed by Approved by Trustee and Authorized by Beneficiary. Except I had never signed anything. These are forged, I said, bile rising in my throat. Every single one of them. I never even knew about the trust. Walter clicked to the next document, images of the alleged signatures. I stared at them. Some were neat attempts to mimic my handwriting, others clumsy scribbles with none of my usual curves or angles. I can get a handwriting analyst, he said. We'll verify the forgeries. I scrolled back through the entries. $30,000 withdrawn for graduate education assistance. Another $20,000 for first home down payment. A $15,000 life milestone gift, labeled under wedding expenses. My share should have been over $1 million, I whispered. Yes, Walter confirmed. Right now, your remaining balance is under $35,000. The rest has been siphoned into other accounts. A chill swept through me. Do we know where it went? Walter reached into the drawer and pulled out a printed spreadsheet. Stanley tracked a good chunk of it. Several of the transfers were rerouted into a joint account between Roger and Janet. From there, the money split into offshore accounts, Luxembourg, Belize. And some of it ended up funding Tyler's startup. The one that failed last year. I blinked. You mean the company he said he built from the ground up? The one he started with your grandmother's money, Walter said flatly. The walls felt like they were closing in. Not just because of the theft, or the ring, or the cruise, but because of how easily they'd done it. How confidently. They hadn't just excluded me. They'd carved out my future piece by piece and handed it to someone else. They were never going to tell me, I said, stunned. They were going to let me turn 30, look at the trust, and see nothing left. And they would have said it had all been spent for my benefit. Just like everything else. Yes, Walter said gently. That's what they were counting on. You not knowing. You not fighting back. I sat in silence for a long time, the clock ticking softly behind us. Then I stood and crossed to the sideboard where Walter kept his old photo albums. I pulled one out, the leather one with gold trim, and flipped through it until I found what I was looking for. A picture of my grandmother, holding the sapphire necklace in her palm. Her eyes sparkled, her smile full of warmth. She'd never had much, but she believed in legacy. In fairness. In leaving something behind for the women in her family to stand on. They can't take this from me, I said, closing the album. They can't take her. No, Walter said. But we can take back everything else. He stood, reached for my hand, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something bloom in my chest. Not anger. Not grief. Resolve. This wasn't just a battle over money. It was a battle over the truth. Over legacy. Over the version of me they tried to erase. And I was done being erased. The email came in at 2:13 a.m. I was sitting on the floor of Walter's study, surrounded by documents, my laptop open and glowing in the dim room. Sleep had abandoned me hours ago. How could I rest when everything I knew about my family had unraveled so violently, so thoroughly? I hadn't heard from Janet, Roger, or Tyler since discovering the truth about the trust, the necklace, and the lies. Their silence had become its own kind of confession. The ping startled me. I looked down at the screen. The sender's name froze me in place. Stanley M. Morgan. Subject: I'm sorry, Layla. I hesitated, chest tightening, then clicked it open. Layla. I owe you an apology that's long overdue. I should have said something years ago. Please find attached the documents I've uncovered. You need to know everything. If you want to talk, I'm here. I've stayed quiet too long. Stanley. Attached were 4 PDF files. My hands trembled as I opened the first one. It was a detailed log of trust transactions, with Stanley's notes scribbled in red. I skimmed past line after line, withdrawal, 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 almost all under my name. I clicked to the second file and my stomach churned. Copies of internal requests, some signed with a forged version of my name, others bearing typed authorizations with Janet or Roger's initials. But the third document was what stopped me cold. A spreadsheet. At first glance, it looked like a set of routine financial records. But as I read, my blood turned to ice. Dozens of transactions were listed under ambiguous categories: consulting, family equity return, health recovery fund. Many of the deposits were filtered through offshore accounts. And beside each suspicious transaction, Stanley had written one word in bold: Layla. Walter, I called, my voice thin. He was asleep in the guest room, but I needed him now. Walter. He appeared moments later, robe tied unevenly at the waist, his eyes wide with alarm. What's wrong? I turned the laptop toward him and pointed. Your brother. He sent this. Just now. He scanned the email and then opened the spreadsheet. Good God, he muttered. They were laundering it. That's what it looks like. I reached for the final file, a scanned letter from Stanley to me. Typed, dated a few days earlier. Layla. I tried to stay neutral. I believed Roger and Janet when they said they were using the trust wisely. They convinced me you were struggling, and I wanted to believe them. But over time, the records didn't add up. They requested early withdrawals from your portion, over $900,000 total. I traced most of it to Tyler's education, his wedding, their business expenses, and personal real estate. I've already reached out to an attorney to help you take legal control of your remaining funds. If you're willing, I'll testify. I sank back in the chair, staring up at the ceiling. They were going to drain everything. They would have left me with nothing and said it was all for me. Walter's expression darkened as he scanned the files. We have everything we need now. This goes beyond favoritism. It's fraud, embezzlement, identity theft. Do we go to the police? Walter's eyes met mine, and I saw steel in his gaze. Not yet. First, we call your lawyer. Then the financial crimes unit. And then we get ready. Because once they realize the game is up, they'll try to disappear. A sudden dread pressed against my ribs. Disappear? Like, flee? I wouldn't put it past them, he said. These offshore transfers? They're setting something up. Moving assets, hiding money. It's exactly what people do before they run. I sat still for a moment, the weight of it all crashing over me. I'd been used, lied to, erased, and now stolen from. And the worst part? They'd done it with confidence. With ease. They hadn't thought I'd ever question it. Because for years I hadn't. But that was over. I rose from the chair, pushing my hair back. Let's make the calls. By noon the next day, we had 3 professionals involved: Walter's longtime attorney, an independent forensic accountant, and an investigator referred to us by Stanley. They reviewed everything Stanley sent and were already stunned by the scope of the deceit. This wasn't casual misuse, the accountant told us via Zoom, his tone clipped. This was a deliberate redirection of funds. Layla's signature was forged at least 14 times. Several of these withdrawals occurred after the fund's conditions clearly prohibited access. And the laundering? I asked. He nodded gravely. The offshore accounts are red flags. Classic tactic to hide stolen money. If this were reviewed by federal authorities, they'd see criminal intent. What happens next? Walter asked. We prepare a case, the attorney replied. We file injunctions to freeze accounts associated with Roger, Janet, and Tyler. Once we secure Layla's claim to the remaining trust, we'll notify authorities. If they've moved money overseas, it could trigger a federal investigation. I sat back, letting the words sink in. It felt strange to think of my family that way. Not just as hurtful or selfish, but as criminals. People who knowingly robbed me of a future and a past with no intention of ever facing the consequences. I want to go public, I said suddenly. The room went quiet. Walter glanced at me. Are you sure? They've spent years building this image of a perfect family, I said. Always smiling. Always polished. But behind the scenes, they've lied and stolen and made me feel like I was the problem. It's time people knew the truth. Walter looked at me with something between pride and worry. That will make you a target. I know. I turned to the computer. But I'm done hiding in the shadows. I drafted the post that night. A single image, the cruise photo Tyler had posted, the one that had shattered my trust. And below it, my words. They told me Grandpa was dying, so they could take my money and go on vacation without me. I canceled my trip. I cried all night. I thought I was losing someone I loved. Turns out I was the one being discarded. Again. Then I added screenshots, snippets from the documents, a few brief annotations, my forged signature, and a final note. This is what betrayal looks like. And I'm not staying silent anymore. I hesitated for a moment. And then I hit post. The response was immediate. Within an hour, it had over 1,000 likes. Friends from college commented in disbelief. Former coworkers messaged to say they were proud of me. Even a few distant cousins chimed in, expressing their shock and support. But then came the text I'd been waiting for. From Tyler. Are you out of your mind? You just ruined everything. Do you even realize what you've done? I stared at the message, heart pounding. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Instead, I turned to Walter. What now? He smiled, slow and certain. Now we finish this. He walked over to his desk and pulled out a folder labeled Morgan and Trent Consulting. The company my father had built his career on, one Walter had co-founded years ago, long before Roger was anything more than an overconfident intern. He opened it and slid a thick document across the table. Effective immediately, he said. You're the majority shareholder. My breath caught. What? I've rewritten my will. And I've updated the ownership. Roger no longer holds controlling interest. You do. I stared at him, stunned. Why? Because you earned it. And because it's time this company and our family name belong to someone who understands the value of integrity. I nodded slowly, fire growing in my chest. This was far from over. But now I had the truth. I had the documents. And I had the power to fight back. The post hit social media like a match dropped in dry brush. By morning, it had spread far beyond my circle of friends. Comments, reposts, and DMs came pouring in, some full of outrage on my behalf, others laced with disbelief. People I hadn't spoken to in years were suddenly messaging me to say they'd seen my story shared on Twitter, LinkedIn, even on a subreddit for financial scams. At first, I didn't respond. I just sat there, numb, staring at the glowing screen as the numbers climbed. 20,000 views. 40. 60. 100,000. Then the local news called. The caption beneath my post was simple. They told me my grandfather was dying. So I'd cancel my plans. So I wouldn't be there. So they could take what was mine. The screenshots beneath it weren't speculation, they were fact. Forged signatures, bank transfers to offshore accounts, statements showing the depletion of my trust fund. I hadn't posted everything, some evidence had to remain under wraps for legal reasons, but I'd posted enough to tell the truth. Enough to be undeniable. I'd attached one last picture, Me and Walter, sitting in the backyard from last spring, smiling. A caption read, "He was never dying. But their conscience might be." And still, I felt sick. Exposing the truth hadn't brought immediate relief. It had brought chaos. My phone vibrated again. Another call from an unknown number. I let it ring out. The previous one had been a journalist from a local Cleveland outlet. The one before that, a lawyer representing another family who suspected similar trust violations. And somewhere between all those calls and emails was a text from Tyler. "You're unbelievable. You think you're the victim? You've ruined everything. I hope you're happy. No apology. No remorse. Just blame." I stared at it for a long moment, thumb hovering above the screen, before finally typing a single word in response. Good. Then I blocked his number. I had nothing more to say to him. Walter sat across from me, reading a paper copy of my post. He glanced up, face unreadable. "You didn't hold back." "No," I said, voice steady. "I didn't." He nodded slowly. "Good. It's about time someone told the truth in this family." I looked at him carefully. "You okay with the backlash?" "I mentioned your name." He waved a hand. "Let them come." "What are they going to do?" "Tell people I gave my granddaughter what was already hers." He walked over to his liquor cabinet and poured himself a small glass of scotch. It was only 10 a.m., but I said nothing. He'd earned it. He turned back to me, glass in hand. "You know, I built Morgan and Trent from scratch with my college roommate. We ran it with integrity for 30 years. I brought Roger in because I thought he'd carry that forward." I looked at him gently. "You couldn't have known he'd turn into this." Walter took a long sip. "Maybe not. But I should have seen it sooner. I let him run the company into the ground with lies and ego. I thought giving him responsibility would mature him. Instead, it just gave him more power to take." I watched him for a moment before I asked, "What about the company now?" He walked to the desk and pulled open a drawer. "That's what I've been working on. It's time for a new CEO." I blinked. "You mean me?" He handed me the papers. "You're now the majority owner. I had the lawyers finalize the transfer yesterday. Roger's shares are revoked. Janet never had any legal claim. As for Tyler, he wasn't even in the picture. It's all yours, Layla." The document felt heavy in my hands, almost surreal. My name was printed in bold at the top, Layla and Morgan, 51% stakeholder, acting CEO of Morgan and Trent Consulting. I swallowed. "Are you sure I'm ready?" Walter smiled. "You've been ready for years. You just didn't know it because they kept convincing you otherwise." I stared at the paper again, pulse racing. Then the doorbell rang. I tensed, heart leaping to my throat. Walter motioned for me to stay seated and went to answer it. From the hallway, I heard muffled voices. A familiar one, sharp, impatient, rehearsed. "Walter, this has gone far enough. You need to shut this down. She's destroying everything we built." "Janet." I stood and walked slowly to the foyer. She was standing just inside the door in a beige trench coat, her eyes scanning the living room with contempt. Her lipstick was smeared at the corner of her mouth. Her hair was pulled back too tightly, like she'd tried to hold herself together in a rush. Behind her, I saw Roger's silver BMW parked crooked in the driveway. When her eyes landed on me, her lips curled. "So, you've decided to air our dirty laundry to the world." I stepped forward calmly. "No. I decided to expose theft, manipulation, and abuse. You're confusing truth with laundry." Janet's jaw tightened. "You always did have a flair for drama. This little stunt of yours, posting lies online." "Nothing was a lie," I said, cutting her off. "I posted documented proof. I haven't even posted everything I have. Yet." Walter stepped between us. "She has more than you realize, Janet. And she has every right to share it." Janet scoffed. "You're choosing her over your own son." "I'm choosing the one who didn't steal from her own family," he replied. "I should have chosen her a long time ago." Roger stepped into the doorway then, his face unreadable. "You'll be hearing from our lawyer," he said flatly. "Defamation. You'll regret this, Layla." I met his eyes. "You should be careful who you threaten." The only regret I have is giving any of you the benefit of the doubt for as long as I did. Just then, another sound broke through the tension, a sharp series of knocks from the front door. Janet turned, already irritated. Who the hell is that now? Walter opened it slowly. Two men in dark suits stood on the porch, badges out. Mr. Walter Morgan, the taller one said. We're with the FBI. We're following up on a financial crimes report filed this week. Roger blanched. What is this? One agent stepped forward. We have a court order to collect financial records related to the Morgan Family Trust and associated offshore transactions. We'll also need access to business files for Morgan and Trent Consulting. Janet's face drained of color. You have no right to. Yes, they do, I said calmly, stepping forward. And you might want to call that lawyer now. The agent stepped into the house as Roger and Janet exchanged frantic whispers. Walter moved to stand by my side, his expression proud. You ready for this? He asked under his breath. I nodded, steady now. Yes, I am. Because the truth was no longer hidden. And I wasn't, either. The sun hadn't even risen when my phone rang, vibrating insistently on the nightstand. I blinked awake, the ringtone piercing through the remnants of broken dreams and tangled sheets. I fumbled to answer, barely registering the caller ID. Layla. Walter's voice came sharp and breathless. He's cleaning out his office. I sat up, heart hammering. What? Roger. He's at Morgan and Trent right now. He showed up early, probably trying to take whatever he can before the paperwork goes public. But I already notified legal yesterday. You're the majority owner now. You need to go stop him. I was already halfway out of bed, throwing on clothes with shaking hands. I'm on my way. I barely remembered the drive there. My thoughts spun in 100 directions. What files was he trying to hide? What assets was he transferring? Would he destroy evidence? I pressed harder on the gas pedal as the glass-paneled headquarters of Morgan and Trent loomed ahead, its familiar steel and stone structure looking colder than ever before. I pulled into the executive lot and slammed the car door behind me. It was still early, only a few cars dotted the parking area. But I spotted Roger's BMW parked close to the rear entrance, half on the curb, engine still ticking. He was inside. I walked straight through the front doors, security nodding hesitantly as I flashed my badge. They recognized me now, not just as Walter's granddaughter, but as the woman from the viral post, the one whose family had imploded on the internet overnight. The receptionist offered a quiet, "Good morning," but I was already halfway down the hall. As I neared the executive floor, I heard raised voices. Papers shuffled, drawers slammed. Then I turned the corner and saw them, Roger, Janet, and Tyler, standing just outside Roger's glass-walled office, their arms full of binders, laptops, hard drives. Tyler was red-faced and sweating. Janet looked pale but focused, flipping through a stack of folders like she could somehow sort their mess into something manageable. And Roger, he still wore that same calm mask, but I could see the panic flickering behind his eyes. He saw me before the others did. His lips pressed into a hard line. Layla. I stopped several feet away, grounding myself, reminding myself who I was now. Not the forgotten daughter. Not the outsider. But the rightful owner of this company. You're trespassing, I said evenly. You don't work here anymore. Tyler scoffed. You're joking, right? Janet narrowed her eyes. You can't seriously think you're in charge. I stepped forward and reached into my bag, pulling out the thick manila envelope I'd been carrying for days now, Walter's revised will, the corporate transfer documents, and the official notarized certification of my controlling interest in Morgan and Trent. I held it out. This is the paperwork, I said, voice steady. Signed, sealed, and filed. As of yesterday, I own 51% of Morgan and Trent. Effective immediately. Roger, your access has been revoked. Janet, you've never been legally employed here, so I suggest you stop rifling through company property. And Tyler, well, you don't even go here. Roger laughed once, a sharp, bitter sound. You think this little stunt will hold up in court? I met his gaze. I don't think. I know. Janet's voice cracked. This company is our legacy. No, I said, louder now. It's Walter's legacy. You just used it. You used everything, including me. Behind me, the elevator dinged. And then, like something out of a movie, a team of uniformed officers entered the hallway, followed by two agents in dark suits. The FBI had arrived. One of them stepped forward, flipping open a badge. Roger Morgan, Janet Morgan, Tyler Morgan, we're here on behalf of the Financial Crimes Division. We have a warrant for company property and personal devices related to the investigation of embezzlement, trust fraud, and identity theft. Janet gasped. Tyler dropped the hard drive he was holding. It clattered to the floor and slid under a filing cabinet. Roger tried to speak, but the agent held up a hand. We've been authorized to seize documents, review surveillance footage, and question all parties involved. You can contact your attorney at any point. I am their attorney, a new voice said. We all turned to see a tall, impeccably dressed woman stride through the doorway, Miranda Lewis, the corporate lawyer Walter had retained years ago. She walked with purpose, her heels echoing on the polished tile. She stopped beside me and gave me a nod. Ms. Morgan is the current CEO. I represent her and the company's interests going forward. Roger stepped back as if burned. Miranda, he said, trying for his usual charm. Come on. You've known us for years. And I've seen the evidence, she cut in. Don't mistake my history with your father as allegiance to you. You're not above the law, Roger. The agents began to separate them. One escorted Tyler into a nearby conference room. Janet clutched her bag tightly, eyes wide as she was led away. Roger lingered a moment longer, turning to me with venom in his voice. You think this makes you better than us? No, I said quietly. I think this makes me free. He sneered. You'll never survive running this company. You're soft. Naive. Everything you have now is because we built it. No, I corrected, stepping closer. Everything I have now is because I endured what you built. He didn't have a comeback. An agent motioned him toward the opposite corridor. He walked stiffly, defeated in a way that didn't feel triumphant, just sad. I watched him go, feeling the weight of every year I'd spent trying to earn his approval dissolve into dust. When the hallway was finally quiet again, I stood at the center of it, looking around at the place I'd been denied a role in for so long. Miranda turned to me. Are you ready to step in officially? I took a breath, slow and deep. Yes, I said. Let's get started. She handed me a new folder. Then you'll want to begin with the internal audit. We've already found several inconsistencies in employee payouts and contractor invoices. I also suggest drafting a statement for staff. We'll need to brief them on the leadership change. I nodded, already flipping through the pages. Schedule an all-hands meeting this afternoon. I want everyone to hear it from me directly. As Miranda walked away to coordinate with the agents, I took a moment to stand alone in the hallway. The walls that had once felt impenetrable now felt like mine to rebuild. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about restoring what had been corrupted, reclaiming a legacy my family tried to twist, and writing a new chapter in a story they never believed I deserved to tell. But now I was telling it. And I wasn't stopping. It was raining again when the indictments came down, thick, pounding rain that blurred the courthouse steps and washed the color from the sky. I sat in the back of the black SUV with tinted windows, watching the reporters gather like birds sensing a storm, microphones clutched like talons. They knew what was coming. The leaks had done their work. The Morgan family scandal was now public record, not just viral gossip. Inside the federal building, Roger and Janet stood in handcuffs. The sight didn't bring me the satisfaction I thought it would. No flood of vindication, no surge of triumph. Just a quiet, aching finality. The kind that creeps in after the damage is done and all that remains is what you'll choose to build in its place. Walter sat beside me, silent, suit pressed, tie slightly off kilter. He was the only person I'd trusted throughout this entire ordeal, and, even now, he didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was enough, a lighthouse in the storm. The door opened, and my attorney climbed in, shutting the umbrella and shaking off the rain. It's done, she said simply, sliding into the front seat. Roger and Janet have been indicted on multiple counts: wire fraud, forgery, embezzlement, and trust violations. The offshore account evidence pushed it over the edge. And Tyler? I asked quietly. She turned to me, her face unreadable. He cut a deal. I felt something twist in my chest. What kind of deal? He offered full cooperation. Detailed everything: who requested the transfers, who forged the signatures, how long it had been going on. He's testifying in exchange for a reduced sentence. No jail time, but he's forfeiting any financial benefit from the trust. And he's agreed to permanent relocation. He won't be a public figure again anytime soon. I looked away, my breath fogging up the window. Of course he'd flipped. Tyler was always slippery when things got hard. First to abandon ship, last to face consequences. Where is he now? I asked. Gone. Witness protection, technically, though it's more like a voluntary exile. He'll be removed from everything. No more trust access. No company ties. He's been completely cut off. Walter shifted beside me. That's more generous than he deserves. I didn't disagree. It was strange how grief lingered even after justice arrived. I wasn't mourning the loss of my family, I was mourning the version of them I'd clung to for so long. The idea that maybe, just maybe, if I worked hard enough or was kind enough, they'd finally see me, want me, love me. But I saw the truth now, and it set me free. Back at the office, the mood was different. Employees bustled in the halls, not whispering anymore, but working with purpose, with relief. The fear that had hung over them during Roger's reign had dissipated like a lifted fog. I'd called the first company-wide meeting just days after the FBI raid. I'd stood in the middle of the executive conference room, every seat filled, every eye on me. I won't pretend this has been easy, I'd said. And I won't pretend we can undo the damage overnight. But this company was built on the belief that hard work and integrity matter. Somewhere along the line, we lost that. But I'm here now. And we're going to rebuild with honesty, with fairness, with transparency. There had been applause. Hesitant at first, then growing. But it was the conversations afterward that mattered. A senior accountant came to me in tears, admitting she'd been afraid to speak up for years. A junior analyst who'd never even met me dropped a memo into my inbox with a brilliant idea for automating client reporting. It felt like people were coming back to life. One of my first official acts as CEO was launching the Morgan Future Fund, a scholarship program for students like me who had to take out loans and work 3 jobs just to survive. We started small, 2 students a year, full tuition and housing, but it felt right. It felt real. Like planting seeds in soil that had been scorched for too long. I also implemented mandatory ethics training, brought in a third-party auditing firm, and made sure every employee, from the janitor to the C-suite, was treated with the same level of respect and opportunity. Some questioned my decisions. Others watched from the sidelines, waiting for me to fail. But most saw the change. They felt it. I worked late most nights, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. This wasn't just a job to me, it was a reclamation. Of power, of voice, of everything I'd been denied. One evening, after another long day, I stood alone in the boardroom, looking out over the city lights. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, older, sharper, steadier. Not the woman I'd been 6 months ago. I heard the door open behind me. "You keep this pace up," Walter said, stepping into the room, "and you'll put the rest of us out of business." I smiled. "You still come in every day." "I'm retired, technically. Just making sure you don't redecorate without me." We shared a laugh, the kind that came easy now. The kind that didn't have years of tension behind it. He stepped beside me, gazing out the window. "You've done good, Layla. I hope you know that." "I'm trying," I said. "Some days I feel like I'm just holding it all together with duct tape and stubbornness." "That's how most good things start," he said with a grin. "Besides, you've got something the others didn't." "What's that?" "A conscience. And the spine to follow it." I looked at him then, emotion thick in my throat. "I didn't want any of this, Walter. I just wanted fairness. A place at the table." "You built your own table," he said. "And now you're inviting others to sit at it." That's leadership. We stood in silence for a while. No more plans to make. No more documents to dig through. Just the calm that followed after the storm had spent itself. And in that quiet, I realized something important. I was no longer reacting to my past. I was shaping my future. With every policy I wrote, every staff member I empowered, every young student given a chance they otherwise wouldn't have had, I was rewriting the legacy they tried to steal. Not just reclaiming what was mine, but redefining what it meant to be a Morgan. Not power for its own sake, but power with purpose. It had taken betrayal to wake me up. But now, I was finally wide awake. And there was no going back. The garden smelled like lavender and earth, warm, calming, familiar. I sat cross-legged on the old wooden bench near the rose bushes, a ceramic mug warming my palms. The morning sun peeked through the clouds, scattering soft gold across the stone path and dancing between the petals. Everything felt quiet. Not the brittle silence that once accompanied grief or anger, but a peaceful kind of quiet. The kind you earn. Walter was beside me, humming faintly as he trimmed a stubborn branch on one of the hydrangeas. His back wasn't what it used to be, but he still insisted on tending the garden himself. Said it kept his soul clear. I believed him. I looked over at him, sipping my tea. Do you ever think about how different things might have been? If none of it had come to light? Walter didn't answer right away. He paused, straightening slowly, shears in hand. Sometimes, he admitted. I think about the years I let pass by without asking the hard questions. About how long I let Roger and Janet deceive both of us. He sank onto the bench beside me with a grunt. But then I remember, if it hadn't all happened when it did, maybe none of it would have changed. Maybe you'd still be carrying the weight in silence. Still believing you were the problem. I looked down at the mug in my hands, feeling the weight of his words. I used to wonder if I was just being dramatic. If all the times I felt like an afterthought were just in my head. They weren't, he said firmly. I know that now, I murmured. But back then, it was easier to keep trying than to admit I wasn't ever going to be chosen. Walter placed a hand on my shoulder, solid and warm. You didn't need to be chosen. You built your way here on your own. And look at you now. The company had changed in ways I hadn't thought possible. It hadn't been easy. Those first few months had been filled with long nights, hard conversations, and a near-constant battle to earn back trust from clients and employees alike. But with every policy I rewrote, every meeting I led, every promise I kept, I watched something extraordinary happen. The culture shifted. People smiled more in the halls. New hires came in from diverse backgrounds, bringing fresh ideas. We created flexible work schedules for parents, promoted transparency in our finances, and launched the scholarship program that now had 5 students already enrolled. 5 young people who didn't have to choose between food and textbooks. My nameplate now read CO, but more than that, I felt like I belonged. Not because of my last name, but because of what I had done. What I was still doing. I glanced at Walter again, his profile calm against the morning light. Do you ever miss them? He exhaled through his nose, thoughtful. I miss the version of them I thought existed. I miss the idea of a family that sat around the table at holidays and loved each other honestly. But I don't miss the reality. I nodded, understanding all too well. I think I miss who I tried to be for them. He turned to me. You don't have to be that person anymore. I know, I said. And strangely, I don't want to be. We sat for a while longer, letting the breeze move around us. The garden buzzed with quiet life, bees darting between petals, birds rustling in the trees. Everything felt grounded, real. I'm proud of you, Walter said at last. You didn't let the betrayal define you. I smiled. Sometimes I think it forged me. Like heat turning metal into something stronger. He grinned, his eyes softening. That's what your grandmother used to say. Betrayal is the fire that forges the strongest steel. She said that to me once, when my business partner nearly tanked our startup back in the day. I laughed, shaking my head. She really was the backbone of everything, wasn't she? Walter's eyes grew distant, wistful. She was. You remind me of her more than you know. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, but full of things unsaid. Then I asked the question that had been quietly forming in the back of my mind for weeks. What happens now? To all of it? The company, the estate, the name? Walter turned to me, face serious now. That's up to you. I've set up everything to transfer cleanly when I'm gone. But I've also made it clear nothing ties you to any of this. If you want to sell the business, walk away, move to the coast, disappear into a vineyard in Italy, you can. You've earned the right to choose your own path. I considered that for a moment. I'd dreamed of disappearing before, of starting fresh far from the wreckage of my name. But now, that dream didn't call to me in the same way. I don't want to run, I said. Not anymore. I want to grow this. Heal it. Make it better than it was. Walter nodded slowly. Then that's what you'll do. I looked out across the garden again, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was chasing someone else's approval. I wasn't trying to belong. I already did on my own terms. What about the vacation? Walter asked, changing the subject gently. Still planning to see Santorini? I chuckled. Eventually. Maybe this time I'll go on my own. No schedules. No guilt trips. Just me, the ocean, and a backpack. You deserve it, he said. And when you go, send me a postcard. I smiled, leaning back on the bench. I will. One with a sunset and maybe a quote from Grandma about steel and fire. He laughed softly, the kind of laugh that made you think everything would be okay. The garden hummed with quiet resilience. Flowers blooming despite the storm. Life returning in slow, deliberate breaths. I thought back to the day I'd packed my bag for that trip, the excitement, the betrayal, the call that changed everything. I'd thought it was the end of something. But it wasn't. It was the beginning. Of truth. Of clarity. Of a life where I didn't wait to be chosen, I chose myself. And now, sitting here in a garden soaked with memory and sunlight, I knew that no matter where the road took me next, I would walk it fully, freely, fiercely. Not as the forgotten daughter. Not as the victim. But as Layla Morgan. The woman who turned betrayal into liberation. And built her legacy from the ashes.